one exercise that we did in Dream Life University and that we often do together to get over analysis paralysis is we get out a sheet of paper and we draw a line down the middle and we write, best position, worst position.
Right.
And we call it the best case scenario, worst case scenario. And we do this with a lot of decisions we make.
Right. Let's talk about our house that we're in right now.
So when we bought this house, we bought it with the sense of it could be our house, but it could be a flip or it could be an Airbnb because it could have been a lot of things. It was a great buy.
Right.
In a really good location.
And we had no intention of moving. I was very, very pregnant. Like, I think when we found it, I was 7 months pregnant.
You were 7 months pregnant when we found it.
Right.
You were 8 months pregnant when we finally closed on it.
Yeah.
So you were 1 month away from delivering Liam when we closed on this house.
Right.
In its previous state.
Yeah. And it was lipstick. It didn't need a ton of work, but we wanted to remodel our bathroom and stuff. So there
were a couple of major renovations that happened, but majority of the house was lipstick.
Yeah.
And we just, on a sheet of paper, we wrote the best case, worst case scenario.
Right. And I mean, the worst case was we sell it and flip it. And the best case was we have our dream house once we're done renovating it. And in that best case, well, in both cases, it involved us moving while I was very pregnant.
Days from delivery.
Yeah.
But in that worst case scenario, we also went down the rabbit holes of, okay, if we sell it, here's the worst case scenario.
Right.
We're X amount of dollars all in. It sells, worst case scenario for this. We stand to make or break or lose this much. Here's another worst case. If we set it up as an Airbnb, here's some of the worst case scenarios.
Right.
Here's the worst case vacancy. Here's the worst case this. And then we said, if we move into it, here's the worst case. We buy it. We're not done renovating it when Liam comes.
Which was fact.
And if that happens, then we make sure one part of the house is done.
Right.
That way we can live in one part of the house while the other part of the house is still getting renovated.
Yeah.
Or we keep our other house that we were currently living in.
We didn't have to move before he was born.
Right.
There was a lot at play.
And then we moved over to the best case scenario.
Right.
And we said, okay, as a flip, here's the best case scenario. It sells top dollar and we could stand to make this much money.
Right.
And on the best case scenario, you want to be realistic, but you also want to let it excite you.
Right.
So best case scenario on the flip, we could have stood to make $200K, right? 150 to 200K on the best case scenario. On the best case scenario on the Airbnb side of it, we could have stood to have made $5,000 to $6,000 a month in the best case scenario.
Right.
And then on the best case scenario of us moving in it, it was we have our dream house.
Right.
The whole house is done in 28 days from closing
and
it's all renovated. And we have our dream house and we have our pool and we have, our theater and we have our podcast studio and we
everything
have your
that
office and
we were going to build on the 10 acres that we had was here and then some. So the best case was we shortcutted our dream property and got it in, today instead of waiting 5 years.
And we got it for about $500,000 less than what it would have cost for us to build this place.
So that was the scenario. Like we broke it down and it's like, okay, we need to buy this because the worst case scenarios on all of these we can handle.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is in Dream Life, we did this with all of our students. We envisioned buying our first properties or something like that. And then we went down and envisioned our worst case scenarios. And then we envisioned our best case scenarios. And then I had them actually try to put themselves in the shoes of the worst case scenario and say, can you live through this?
Yeah. I mean, it's like we talked about earlier, all the things that steps, you should focus on step 1 and 2. But if you can't and you feel the need to plan out future steps, okay, a tenant doesn't pay and you have to evict them. What is the worst case scenario?
Yeah.
You hire an attorney and you're out $1,000.
Right.
You give them cash for keys and you're out $1,000. You miss a couple months of rent. So all in, let's say absolute worst case scenario is $5,000 at most.
Right.
And yes, they could damage the property, but we have found generally if you're nice to them and work with them and don't get into the nasty fighting matches that a lot of tenants will try to push, they leave the house in great shape.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the absolute worst case scenario when looking at your first 1 to 5 properties Your worst case scenario typically leads to you having to sell the properties at a loss. You have some type of really bad debt that you have to carry, or you broke even and now you just don't have any properties, or you go bankrupt, right? And like you're in a really bad spot financially.
Right.
You bankrupted, you got out, but your worst case scenario is essentially your current state. You are still like me. If we worst case scenario our first 5 properties, I left teaching already.
Yeah.
In those first 5 properties. If we worst case scenarioed in our first 5, what would have happened is we would have went bankrupt, right? And you would have stayed at your job, your corporate job. I would have went back to teaching.
Right.
We would have learned a really hard lesson. We would spend the next 5 to 7 years paying off that debt that we may have had, or recovering our credit.
Right.
And learning what we did wrong.
Yeah.
And ready to tackle it again.
Right. The idea is, let's take the absolute worst thing that could happen to you and write it out and look at it on paper. And then you realize, well, it's not that likely that we're going to have to file bankruptcy after buying 2 houses.
Right. The more likely is you're going to have to sell for a break even or a small loss and move on with your life.
Right.
With all of the knowledge and experience that you gained doing it.
Right.
Which usually positions you to be more successful the next time around.
Right. As you're focusing on steps 1 and 2, don't go into steps 5 with no resources or education. You want to take it slowly.
Yeah.
But if you're terrified of tenants and renovating a house, flip one. Yeah. Learn that renovation side of it. Learn the buying, the renovating, and the selling side. And then the next one, buy and make it a rental. And that way you know how to renovate and buy, and then you're just adding on the step of leasing at the end instead of selling.
Yeah.